I think people often look at the sold price and then the buy price, and they don't factor in how much they've paid in stamp duty, how much they've paid in interest back to the bank.
Everyone wants to buy low and sell high.
What we've found is sellers do want to sometimes exit that market. If they can act quick enough buyers, they can really get good value on a purchase.
They say a property cycle lasts 7 to 8 years and is typically characterised by a boom, a slowdown, a slump and a recovery. However, factors like population growth, interest rates and government policies all play a part in what a cycle can really look like. Here with me today to break down the often misunderstood concept of property cycles and why understanding these is actually crucial to your own property journey is Anne Flaherty, Senior Economist at REA Group, and Anthony Molinaro from O'Brien Real Estate in Blackburn. Thanks both so much for coming on the show today. I do love this topic because for me, a property cycle is unpredictable, right? There's so many outside influences that all come into play, and these outside influences do feel like they're just ever-changing, ever-evolving. And in its most basic form, can you give us a top-line definition of what a property cycle is?
So essentially a property cycle is like any other cycle. You have your ups, you have your downs, and then we see that pattern repeat over time. I think one of the interesting things about a property cycle, though, is that we typically see that cycle happen in an upwards direction. In Australia's case, we typically see pretty short-lived downturns and much longer protracted upturns.
Mm-hmm. Why is that?
I think it comes down to Australia's demographics. We are a very rapidly growing country. We don't build homes quickly enough. That's particularly been the case in recent years. And that's one of the factors that has underpinned that strong demand for housing, which of course seems to be outpacing the speed at which we can build new homes.
Do we have any historical examples that really highlight the entire cycle?
I think Perth's actually a really interesting example of a property cycle in Australia because there's a lot of factors at play there. That's a market that's very heavily reliant on what's happening in the mining sector. And we know that when that sector is very strong, we see very rapid growth in Perth prices because the population of Perth increases. On the other side of that, though, that's a market where we do see longer downturn periods when we see population leave as a result of a slowdown in that sector.
Is a lot of that population growth and decline due to like fly-in, fly-out workers?
Definitely a major contributor, especially if you were to look at the rental market. Just in general, we typically see some of the suburbs in Perth have astronomical prices. They're some of the most expensive suburbs in the country.
Oh.
In fact, that means that when we do see the downturn, those are the kinds of suburbs that can see the most dramatic shifts in values.
So, Anthony, in your career, how many property cycles do you think you've been through?
I reckon I've been through around 2 property cycles in that period, and they do happen every 7 to 8 years, but sometimes for unforeseen circumstances.
So what have been those defining factors for those property cycles? You know, was it a change in government? Was it a recession? Or perhaps, I don't know, the 13 rate rises that we had in the last couple of years?
I think they all contribute, absolutely. Yep. I think we went through one about 5 years ago as well, obviously the pandemic, which is something that wasn't factored in and took us all by surprise. But these typically do make major plays to how the market reacts to those things.
Do property cycles vary significantly, I guess, from state to state, region to region?
They definitely do. As I mentioned earlier, Perth is a case where we do see dramatic cycles, but then in other capitals such as Melbourne and Sydney, where we have more diverse economies, stronger long-term population growth, we don't typically see the level of peaks and troughs that we might see in other markets. Very interesting as well, it comes down to supply, as I mentioned earlier. And I think a classic example of that is if we look at what's happening around the country, over the past 5 years, we've seen 80% growth in Queensland, in WA, in South Australia. But then on the other hand, in Melbourne, we've only seen about 15% growth over 5 years. So a lot of it has to do with those underlying fundamentals. How many homes are we building? What is population growth looking like? And of course, interest rates.
But what are some of the key indicators you look for when predicting different phases of a property cycle, kind of besides that population growth aspect?
I think interest rates are a major one. If we look at that massive run of growth we had in recent years, that was driven by the fact that interest rates were slashed to record low levels. It made it very cheap to borrow, which meant that people could borrow a higher amount and put that into the value of a property. Now, I think economic factors also come into play, but not as much in the property market as we might see in the stock market. And I think a good example of that was the global financial crisis. We saw a little blip in property values, but it wasn't really that prolonged. And because interest rates were cut in response to that economic turmoil, that actually drove property prices to new record highs without too much time passing.
One of the elements of a property cycle is the expansion phase. So what typically happens during this part?
When prices are expanding, we're normally seeing one of a few potential factors. So lower interest rates, making it more affordable to borrow. Also, sometimes schemes. So, for example, it could be a first home buyer scheme, something to incentivize buyer demand that leads more potential buyers into the market. Also, confidence. And I think when people believe that the market is in an upwards movement, they're more likely to be willing to pay a bit extra for that property because they feel like they're going to make a profit over a relatively short period of time.
And typically in that expansion phase, we also see like demand outweighs supply.
Definitely. So that's really a key factor.
What about the recovery phase? What happens here?
Well, first of all, people need a roof over their head. So we always see buyers in the market. But I think for some buyers, they might say, hang on, we're in a pretty a situation here where there's not as much demand as there might have been. There's a lot of good opportunity out there. It might be a great time to actually get into the market, pick something up for a relatively good value that's hopefully going to recover over the longer term.
Anthony, why do you think that buyers and sellers need to be aware of these factors? Like, do you think it allows them to then make strategic property decisions?
Yeah, I do. I think property, what people don't understand sometimes is it's a long-term game. So although they're trying to act now, they've got to look at the bigger picture when making these important decisions. So infrastructure and so on is definitely going to play a factor. Even sentiment from the banks and how they're discussing what they're thinking. Little things like this can make a huge play. So I think buyers and sellers need to have their ear to the ground just to see what's happening because the sentiment in the market can change very quickly.
Do you ever see buyers waiting, trying to predict the market?
All the time. And it's funny because I totally get it. I think it's a human nature thing. If I could try to buy at the lowest point, and even if I'm a seller and can try to sell at the highest point.
Yeah, buy low, sell high. Yeah. That is the property dream.
Yeah, but what I find most of the time with buyers waiting is by the time it's obvious to act, it's probably past them a little bit. And sometimes they need to act sooner before them waiting for the perfect time.
So do you have an example of someone that was holding off for, say, a downturn and it just never came?
The classic example is probably, I know it's unbelievable now, 5 years ago, just pre-COVID. So the sentiment from the market, the banks, even the government to some extent was we're going through a pandemic and the market's going to plummet. And in Melbourne, that was the draw card of this is going to happen real bad. And it went to worst case scenario. So people just held and said, okay, well, we'll wait for the market to drop to completely bottom out and we're going to act. The flip side happened. It was a strange market because people were buying without seeing. And what was happening in that time, it was increasing. So interest rates did play a factor because they still remained extremely low. That time was an interesting time, but for buyers, they probably waited too long. And by the time they actually acted, because they did need that roof over their head, they probably overpaid a little bit.
Do you know what, to your point about like buying without seeing, I can remember during that time, properties would go up on realestate.com.au. An hour they'd come down because someone's already bought it. Like I remember speaking to an agent who said during that pandemic period, her agency, which is in the Bayside area, listed and sold a property per day for the month of August. And she's like, we've not done that before. We've not done that since.
Yeah.
What can buyers do during, the downturn period of a property cycle? Like how would you advise, Anthony, that they kind of go about capitalizing?
Okay, so it's actually a great time to buy during a downturn. Thinking of that long-term growth in terms of it is a long-term game. I find that there's usually less competition in a downturn. So for a buyer, this is advantageous to negotiate a bit better. They can also find that sellers are probably more motivated in this time to act. Obviously, doing their due diligence is going to be paramount. So whether that means getting their finances organised first, but in terms of negotiating terms, not just price, it's going to be beneficial in a downturn market because what we've found is sellers do want to sometimes exit that market. And if they can act quick enough buyers, they can really get good value on a purchase.
All right. So on the flip side, so now moving on to that boom phase, what can buyers do during that phase? Because if it's a boom, we said before, demand outweighs supply. It makes it harder for buyers. Like what can they do?
Yeah. So key there is to act as fast as possible. And I know that's hard to comprehend sometimes, but sometimes if you're waiting too long in a rising market, you get priced out very, very quickly. And by the time you realize it's you have to go back to the bank to ask for more money. And it's as simple as that. So a market can shift very quickly within a quarter to 6 months. And what you could afford 3 months ago, now you might be able to miss it. So if you can act as quickly as possible, that would be my biggest recommendation, especially in a boom phase.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that happen to people in my personal world, sold a property with the intention of upgrading, and during that very small period of time, the Sydney market ran away from them, and then it ended up being like 4 to 5 years before they then bought back in. How long do you typically have to live in a property to ride out the impacts of those booms and those downturns? Is it the longer the better? It honestly feels like we're never too far from a property increase in this country.
Definitely the case is the longer the better. And I think one of the reasons for that is the taxes that we pay. Every time that we sell and buy a new home, we have to fork out for stamp duty. Now, I think people often look at the sold price and then the buy price, and they don't factor in how much they've paid in stamp duty, how much they've paid in interest back to the bank. And if you factor all of those things in, even if you were to sell, in a relatively short period of time for a decent profit, odds are you might even just be breaking even. That's one thing to consider. We know that for people who sell and buy quite frequently, often they're in a much worse position than they would otherwise be, because they've probably spent potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on how many times they've sold and bought, in stamp duty costs.
Yeah, it's major. But if we shift gears now to a seller focus, Anthony, how do you guide sellers through these two phases, the boom and then the recovery? Because each one obviously does provide different results. A downturn is typically bad for sellers because we said before, the market's less crowded. But in a boom, like stock's low, buyers can be desperate and sellers can get some great results.
I think it goes down to strategy. In a downturn, we try to focus on the right marketing, setting the right price to attract buyers, because of that competition is lower. And I don't like using the word being realistic, but being competitive is probably a better way of what's been sold. And so the historic data on a market that's it's important within 1 to 3 months, not further than that. We've already discussed how that market can change pretty quickly. In a boom, this is where we shift gears and we can maximize momentum. So you've already gotten good sentiment within the market of what's happening. Interest rates might be low. There might be incentives from the government that have been implemented. So if we can act on them pretty quickly, then what we find is we drive the competition to really heat up. So each phase needs a different approach, but what we do is we tailor what we feel is the best for that particular market. And that can be small things, but the way it's presented, the way it's marketed, the way that you can draw on what's happening outside of the property market, and that can be government incentives and so on, is really, really important.
Well, it is a tough one because pretty much, like I said before, everyone wants to buy low and sell high. How do you advise people when they want to sell, but they actually might not make back their purchase price? That's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, they're tough conversations to have. And that's why I think it's really important to be honest and be ahead of the game and look at historical data, especially from realestate.com.au, where they've got the insights on what's happening within every market. So we try to focus on the reason that they are selling. And this can be simple as a job relocation or an interstate opportunity. And these can be urgent. So we try to flip it to find out where they're going and what's going to be better for them in the long term. So sometimes that can be that tough conversation if you can hold out, and sometimes you can't. But if you can, it might be okay to try to do that. But it might be better to make that smarter move of, okay, well, put your chips in, cash them in here and better it in the other market, especially if there's different markets over there. They're never great conversations to have, but it really depends on the bigger picture and their personal circumstances. So I think you can try to make it as a business decision more than you can an emotional decision. That tough conversation is easier to be had.
So those people who, I guess, can't ride it out, maybe they need to move for whatever reason. Let's say they are staying in the same marketplace. It can't be all bad though, right? Because if they're selling low, surely they're then going to buy, like the whole market's low, right? So you sell a bit lower, you buy a bit lower.
So I think if you buy and sell in the same market, it doesn't make a huge difference.
Yeah.
However, I'm going to give you an example. It can if you are upsizing. So, for example, you're selling your 2-bedroom unit in a market where there's a downturn, let's say an average of 10%. So if it's easy maths, you're selling for 500, you take 50,000 off that. It's now going to probably get 450, but you're buying at $1 million, and that's also come down 10%.
So you're buying at 900.
Yeah. So I know that we look at 100,000 as the difference of the $1 million and $9 million, and we look at 50,000 at the 5 and 450. There's still an opportunity there because you're buying and selling in the same market. You're actually upsizing and probably getting a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
So,
and then when that market shifts, things kind of work in your favour.
Correct.
All right. So, Anne, what about today's landscape, right? Where are we now, do you think, in the property cycle?
I think we're definitely in a growth phase, and the reason for that is that interest rates are moving lower this year. I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens when the government's first home buyer schemes, which have been expanded pretty significantly, come into play. Now, I think there could potentially be an opportunity in the market for investors at the moment because the current timeline for these expanded first home buyer schemes is early next year, end of this year, depending on which scheme you look at. From an investor's perspective, then they know that there's probably going to be a wave of first home buyers coming. And they're also in a market where interest rates are forecast to come down further. Now, when we know interest rates are predicted to come down further, it's pretty much very, very strong likelihood that property prices will rise in the meantime. The other thing overlaying that is the massive shortfall in homes we're building. So there's been around a third shortfall in the total number of new homes built. And depending on the market you look at, that can be as high as around 50% shortfall. So there's quite a few factors at play, which mean that even if we're to see an economic downturn, even if we're going to see more global economic shocks, that underlying demand for homes, lower interest rates is very likely to push prices higher this year.
Okay, so in looking forward, what long-term trends do you foresee impacting property cycles? Do you think that, I mean, this is one that I don't know if will play a big factor, it might, but the rise in technology and the way in which we use it for property purchases is completely different from even a decade ago, right? So do you think that tech could play a role in shaping current and future cycles?
Well, I think technology has the potential to help educate people. I think we're entering a phase where we have more clarity around property values than we did even 10 years ago.
Information has never been more accessible.
Exactly. So I think that information means that people are, more likely to be making a conscious, well-informed decision about what a property is worth. I think it'll be fascinating to see what will happen with the way we even build homes and how technology comes into that because, of course, labour shortages, massive increases in construction costs are the underlying factor for why, when we're not building enough homes. So if we can find a much more cost-effective way of delivering more homes, that could have the potential to slow the speed at which we do see home values rise.
I spoke with an agent once who said that like the rise in tech, he said that sometimes buyers coming through his properties are educating him on like the past value of the property. They might go on property.com or something and find out all this information that he's like, oh, cool. Yeah, thanks for letting me know. But Anthony, my last question is for you. What are your top tips for both buyers and sellers in navigating property cycles? What do you think is just the key thing they must remember?
So I'll start with buyers. For buyers, I think it's about being informed. So I love hearing that story that you said that the buyer came to the open and knew more about it than the agent did. And as surprising as that is, I think that's paramount if you're buying to know as much as possible. And that's a great sign. Get your finance in order. And probably the most recommended is don't try to pick the perfect moment to buy. Pick the moment that's right for you, not just the market as a buyer. Time in the market is going to be harder than time in the market. So if you can pick the time that's going to suit you, your lifestyle choices, that's probably going to be better than trying to pick a market because it's exceptionally hard. And even though the information available is amazing, I think sometimes you've got to pick on your personal circumstance.
I think also lives don't wait for property cycles. And I've said this with agents before because, obviously like spring selling season is typically the best time to buy and sell. Lives don't wait for seasons. They don't wait for cycles.
It's funny you mention I love selling properties in winter because there's less competition. So you're selling in isolation and not against everyone else. So the sentiment is, we'll wait for the springtime because the flowers are blossoming and the weather is better.
Sometimes waiting is a luxury though. Like, for example, if you're having a baby, it is coming. It doesn't, if it's due in May, it's not going to say, hey, mum and dad, I'm going to hold out till September so you guys can time your property purchase better.
What happens if the interest rate goes up twice in that time?
Correct, yeah, exactly.
So
And what
things
would
are
you
hard.
say to sellers?
For sellers, understand the market you're in and work with someone that can hold your hand and guide you through it. So timing helps, but preparation and strategies probably outweighs timing for me. So any cycle, what we've found is quality properties always still find a demanding market.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got something in regards to a property that's appealing and ticks the right boxes, you're going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And presentation's going to outweigh trying to time the market. So if it matters most to move, then do it as a seller, but just make sure you presented the property in the absolute best you can.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed learning about the different aspects of a property cycle, and I think our listeners will have got some really valuable information.
Thanks, Alice.
Thanks, Alice.
Thanks for joining me. This has been Real Talk. For your weekly fix, please follow wherever you listen to your podcasts and tune in next time for more real questions, news and insights on the topics that matter most from realestate.com.au, Australia's #1 address in property. All information provided is general advice and opinion based on current market conditions. These opinions should not be treated as investment advice. Always obtain advice based on your individual circumstances.
Real Talk acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, air and community. We pay our respects to elders past and present.